And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Welcome to the Republic News Network, live national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'll be acting as the moderator. It is July the 28th of 2016, and tonight's featured RNN show is Connecting the Dots with Mr. Dan Happel. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show for over 6 years, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. It's true the United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction lies within the borders of District of Columbia, and you can find this information under Title 28, Section 3002, and UCC 9-307H. The Republic government was just a bunch of U.S. citizens that realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders had intended for us. We've been hard at work now for about 8 years, and we successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government. You can consider the Republic members are tired of all the corruption that we see every day. So you found in the law that there is, in fact, 2 forms of government here on our land, and we did something about it. We're the people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you, and we're very concerned. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you, too, are about to be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and the Republic of the United States of America. But before we go into our broadcast, please bow your head in prayer. Lord, we just want to thank you for this show and the truth that is brought out. Protect the people on this call. Protect this republic. Protect your nation, Lord. We love you, and we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Mr. Dan Happel, I yield the floor to you, sir.
Yes. Hi, Kelby. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a new Connecting the Dots program tonight with 2 very special guests. We have Harriet Hageman and Ken Ivory. Harriet is an attorney out of the Cheyenne, Wyoming area. She specializes in water rights and land use law, and she has been very actively defending property owners in the Rocky Mountain region for quite a long time. Also, Ken Ivory, who I'm sure a lot of our guests are familiar with. Ken is a legislator from the state of Utah, and he was the primary sponsor of HB 148, the bill that brought the transfer of public lands from the federal government to the state of Utah into the fore. And this was a bill that was brought forward. It was passed through the legislature. And although the bill was signed into law 4 years ago, the federal lands have remained in control of the U.S. Department of the Interior, and they have refused to turn over those lands to the state as required under the Enabling Act. So with our guests tonight, we are going to have a thorough discussion of the fact that property and transfer of public lands to the states, as was required when those states entered the Union under the Enabling Act, are not being honored in the western states, and we'll get into a discussion of just exactly how and why those things are happening. We were having a bit of a problem getting our guests online. They were receiving a message that our call-in line was an incorrect line. We've been having some problems recently because of, I think, the fact that we're getting awfully close to the target on a lot of areas, and so we've been having some technical problems that, quite frankly, sometimes are not very explainable. So, Harriet, are you on the line now? Have you managed to get on the line?
Yes, I have. Thank you.
Bingo. Okay, good. And Ken, are you on the line as well?
I am.
Wonderful. Okay, we are here. All right. Well, I did a kind of a lead-in to exactly what tonight's discussion will be about, and I would like to lead off with, Ken, maybe you giving a little bit of a background on how the debate started and how the public lands issue started to be a very, very central issue to a lot of the western states as a result of some of the actions that happened with the closure of some of the public parks and things like that when the budget debate happened. And I know that was one thing that caused a lot of the states to have a lot of angst. But Ken, you're kind of the guy that started this whole process back in 2011, and I would love to give you the opportunity to take the floor for a few minutes and kind of flesh out that statement.
Well, thanks, Dan. I'm honored to be on, and particularly honored to be on with Harriet. She's a dear friend and very wise counsel. So it's a treat. But to your point, it all started with a very simple question. I mean, I'm a dad that wants the best for my state. I want to see my state have full opportunity going forward, and yet we're 30% dependent as a state on a federal government that it tells us itself every year. The Government Accountability Office says it's broke, and that's 30% of our revenue as a state. Well, we look at our lands, and 67% of the land in the state of Utah is occupied territory of the United States. It owns title to the land, but only as a trustee, just like it did for all states west of the original 13 colonies. And we had a very simple question that we asked: well, why the difference? Why is it like that? Why does the federal government control and still retain 50% of the land west of the Rocky Mountains and substantially less than 5% of the land east of the Rocky Mountains? And Dan, I got to tell you, when we started on this quest, the answers to those questions were really quite ridiculous. I mean, we were asking law professors and political science professors and members of Congress, why does the federal government control 50% of our land? And initially, some of the answers were as silly as, well, you see, your land is arid. It's dry, so therefore the federal government keeps your land. And you almost fell out of my chair. I'm like, are you serious? You know, where's the arid clause of the Constitution? And yet, with a straight face, they were making these arguments because no one had ever challenged them and said, you know, that's just ridiculous on its face. Well, then they moved to saying, well, you just gave up the land. You just didn't want it. The pioneers of Utah and Montana and Idaho and the rest, they just didn't understand the value of property at statehood, and they just gave up the land. And they cherry pick about 6 words of the Enabling Act and say, well, therefore you gave up the land. But Dan, as you know, the statehood agreements of Utah, for Pete's sakes, the statehood agreement of Montana is the same document as North and South Dakota. The agreements are exactly the same, and yet we're not following fundamental principles of our American promise, the equal protection of the law, equality under the law, equal protection of the law, fundamental fairness. And then it came down to their final reason as to why they would say that it's okay for the federal government to retain 50% of the land west of the Rockies. They say, well, you people west of the Rockies, you just can't manage your own land. You've got to have the federal government manage it for you, so you're something of a lesser class of state than the states east of the Rockies. Well, of course, in December of last year, we commissioned a legal analysis from some of the top constitutional attorneys in the nation. We knew all of those arguments were nonsense, but we wanted to have the credibility of having some of the top attorneys in the nation, one of whom they refer to as the Michael Jordan of constitutional law. Professor Ron Rotunda wrote the 6-volume treatise on the Constitution. They performed a legal analysis, 150 pages of the history, the law, the Constitution, and they concluded, not surprisingly to us, the federal government has no authority, zero, none, zilch, nada, to treat Utah and Montana and Idaho and the others like a second-class citizen. And so from there, we're moving forward and moving to simply have our states be treated equally so that we can get to better access of our lands, better health of our lands, and better productivity. Of course, we see the fires, the millions and millions of acres burned because the federal government simply locks up our lands, leaves them in catastrophic condition. The forests are dead and dying all over the West and burning up wildlife and habitat, destroying watershed. It really is a travesty, and it just simply doesn't have to be that way. Across the globe, I mean, Canada, other places, it's a truism that those who are closest to the land, those whose lives and livelihoods depend upon the land, are better stewards of their land than an absentee slumlord. And that's what we're seeing throughout the West. And so it's simply time for our nation, for our states, for our people, and for the land. It's time for the federal government to honor the exact same statehood promises, to honor the exact same constitutional obligations to relinquish control of our lands, that we can get to this economic, environmental, constitutional renaissance.
Good, good. Well, I also know that Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, who was back in the mid-19th century, suffered a similar concern and issue, and in fact, he required that the Senate and the Congress allow some of those, and you laughingly refer to them as the western states, such as Florida and Tennessee and places like that, to have their land turned from the federal government over to the states. Would you kind of explain how that all happened?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, as I'm speaking to you, I'm actually in Indiana right now. Indiana was one of the western states that was 90% federally controlled for decades. Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, of course, that western state of Florida, right? For decades, the federal government controlled 90% of their land. Florida, the legislature of Florida, used to send resolutions to Congress saying, we're the worst off of all the western states. You're not disposing of our land as the Constitution requires. We can't educate our children, grow our economy. Our people are leaving the state to find opportunity elsewhere. And it was Thomas Hart Benton, this Democratic senator from Missouri, who said, my election to the Senate found me doing battle for changing this system of disposing of the land. He said, I resolved to move against this whole system. He says, and he did it in speeches and bills, and got the people rallied to battle for their equality, the fundamental treatment, and have them dispose of the land, and they did. I mean, Illinois was 95% federally controlled for decades, worse than Nevada is today. And they have the exact same statehood terms for the federal government to relinquish their lands. The constitutional obligation of the federal government to relinquish lands are the same. And it's time that the western states simply are treated not as a redheaded stepchild, but an equal union of states. Because, Dan, if the western states can be held hostage for pittance payments, these token payments in lieu of taxes, then any time the federal government wants to grow, they simply put the gun to the head, if you will, of the western states and say, hey, if you want that funding that we're providing because you can't tax your land for schools and police and fire and roads and health and human services, you've got to agree to these bills that spend billions and trillions of dollars, and that happens on an annual basis. And so we don't have an equal union of states that can be an effective check to the federal government if we have this divide and conquer where the western states are simply dependent on the East. In fact, the greatest debate, it's still on the U.S. Senate website. They call it the greatest debate in U.S. Senate history between Daniel Webster and Robert Hayne in 1830. He said, do you know what the greatest debate in Senate history was about in 1830? It was about the federal control of public lands of the western states of Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas and Alabama. And Robert Hayne says this. He says, never will the federal government, or rather those who control its operations, consent to emancipate the West by adopting a wise and just policy looking to any final disposition of the public lands, while the people of the West can be kept in subjection and dependence by occasional donations of those lands. And never will the western states themselves assume their just and equal station among their sisters of the Union, while they are constantly looking up to Congress for favors and gratuities. It's exactly where we are today. History just keeps repeating itself. There's nothing new under the sun. We either control our land to freedom, or it's controlled over us to feudalism.
That's exactly right. Incidentally, I was on a forestry tour of Germany. It's been 5 years ago, through the Montana Forest Stewardship Foundation. And we toured the states of Germany, where they have a very high percentage of either state or private ownership on their forests. I think the forests in Germany are somewhere around 5% federal ownership. The rest is states and private ownership. And one of the comments that came out of that was that a very socialist country like Germany, the state governments that were controlling these forests are very rapidly, as they can, they're turning those state forests over to private ownership because of the cost and the stewardship issues. And you're exactly right. You take better care of your own car than you do of a rental car. And you take better care of your own property when you own that property than someone who's a renter, and that's just that goes without saying. Harriet, I saw you for the first time last fall when you did a speaking engagement for the American Lands Council meeting in Salt Lake City, and I have to say I was incredibly impressed with your ability as a speaker and how well you covered the subjects of water rights and public lands. And I would like to give you the floor to maybe talk about some of the issues that you've encountered in Wyoming and throughout the West that you've been involved with from a legal standpoint that tie into this public lands issue.
Well, I appreciate that, Dan. Thank you very much for the compliment coming from you. That means a lot to me, and it's wonderful to visit with Ken Ivory. I haven't seen him since last fall, but I know we need to get back together to continue this battle that we've both been fighting kind of in on different paths, if you will. I so much appreciate what Ken has said, and one of the things that struck me so much was the manner in which the federal government, these various agencies and the executive branch do go to our representatives in Congress, and we are forced into a situation where we have to support things like the omnibus budget bill and things like that, because that's the only way we can get funding for some of the things that need to be addressed in the Western United States. I believe the Forest Service has indicated that they have an $11 billion backlog for road construction and maintenance. The BLM is I don't know that it's quite that high, simply because it's a different type of land, if you will, but that should give you some indication of how poorly the federal government really is managing our resources. And those resources would be better managed at the state level for a lot of different reasons, including those reasons that both of you have already identified. I just truly believe that the government that is closest to its people is more responsive, more reactive, more accountable, and that includes everything from your county commissioners to your state legislators to your governors, as well as to the folks who are going to be managing these resources. It is awfully difficult to get a hold of somebody in the Forest Service to complain someone who can actually make a difference in the Forest Service to complain about the manner in which they have managed that resource and to address such things as the beetle outbreak, which is largely caused by mismanagement by the Forest Service. It's very difficult to get a hold of someone and hold someone accountable for the loss of literally millions of acres of land to catastrophic forest fires and to the pine beetle outbreak if you have to go through Washington, D.C., if you have to try to find somebody back there that could be held accountable for what is done. Whereas here in the state of Wyoming, being a smaller state, I recognize that, or at least a less populated state, if I need to get a hold of someone in our state lands division, I can find them. We at the legislature can hold folks accountable for mismanagement or poor management. Right now we are seeing catastrophic forest fires throughout the western United States, which is a very common thing that happens at this time of year, and it becomes more and more of a commonality simply because, again, of the mismanagement of that particular resource. We see that the pine beetle outbreak was in large part originated in the Route National Forest from a blowdown that occurred in 1997 when a blowdown happened one night. 13,000 acres of trees were knocked down. Everybody recognized that if they didn't go in and treat that area and harvest that timber, there was going to be a beetle outbreak. I have GAO reports. There were 2 GAO reports that were issued addressed to this, one in 1999 and one in the year 2000, both of which identified that if they didn't address that particular situation, there was going to be a terrible, terrible pine beetle outbreak. And in fact, that is what has happened. Right now, it's more difficult to see simply because so many of the trees have died. And when you look at a forest, it's harder to detect some of that. But for a period of time, you would go through our national forest and see nothing but a sea of red. And that was because of that beetle outbreak. Then you get the excuses of, well, it's global warming. We need to have 30 days a year of 40 below zero weather and it will kill the beetle. But because we don't get 40 below zero weather anymore, the beetle is able to survive and thrive because of global warming. And then you look back at the historical record and you realize, well, we never had 30, 40 days a year of 40 degree below zero weather to keep the pine beetle in check. The other thing that you notice is in those areas where we raise trees as a row crop, such as southeastern United States, in areas where the lands are privately owned, they don't have nearly the problem with the pine beetle. You look in Europe, they don't have the problem with the pine beetle like we do. So if it were caused by global warming, you would expect to see it on a much wider basis. But what you do see is you see it emanating out from that blowdown that occurred in 1997 because of the controversy of attempting to do something in a wilderness area surrounded by a roadless area. The Forest Service completely abdicated their responsibility, and as a result, we're losing millions and millions and millions of acres of lands. I struggle with the idea of what our federal government has done with the National Forest Service lands, in large part because most people don't realize this, but our national forest lands are managed within the Department of Agriculture. When the national forests were created by the Organic Act of 1897, they were created not as national parks, not as set-asides, not as lands that were not to be managed for multiple use. They were created for the sole purpose of a continuous supply of timber and a continuous supply of water. There are about 192 million acres of National Forest Service lands, and about 2/3 of those are in large part set aside to do nothing with anymore because of the radical environmental agenda that has been blazing through our society for the last 40 years. So what you see is that an agency that was created for purposes of managing a resource for use and development has been completely corrupted within the Washington, D.C. model and is no longer doing what it was created to do. It now looks at lands, again, as national monuments, wilderness areas, roadless areas, all of these different designations. And as a result, they're not properly managing the resource the way that it was intended to be managed. I will say, one of the things that I think is so incredibly important to this entire effort, and it's why I commend Ken Ivory so much, is that education is so terribly key on getting this process moving forward, gaining momentum, and getting people to understand what it is that we're trying to do and why. I deal with a lot of people. I deal with a lot of engineers. I deal a lot with water hydrologists and different folks. And I deal with people from a broad political spectrum, from you're very liberal to you're very conservative. And the misinformation and misunderstanding about this effort, I think, is something that has hindered its ability to move forward. I was actually visiting with a person just this week, and I was talking about the fact that we could do a better job. In Wyoming, we could do a better job at managing this resource than the manner in which it is managed out of Washington, D.C. I said, all you need to do is look at our catastrophic forest fires and the fact that we're not only losing millions of acres of timber, and it's going to affect our watersheds, it's going to affect our long-term water supplies for our municipalities and those sorts of things, but it just truly is causing an environmental disaster. And he made the comment, I would rather they burn to the ground than brought them into state management or into private ownership.
Yeah,
and
there are a lot of people that feel that way in the environmental movement, and that is a real problem, because the environmental movement, as it's constituted right now, just they really don't care about the environment. They care about control and taking all the federal lands and putting them into, well, their vision of a pre-Columbian wilderness, and it'll never work.
Well, nor would we want it to. What would be the purpose of that?
Right.
What would be the purpose of that? I mean, even if that kind of a pie in the sky idea, even if that were possible, what would be the purpose of that in the long run? How many head of deer, how many head of elk, how many beavers, mice, rats, whatever they may be, have died in these fires in just the last 2 weeks? How many endangered species, whether vegetation or mammals, that have been killed as a result of these types of activities? It doesn't make sense, but you did hit it on the head, and it comes back to control and money. And regardless of whether you have an $11 billion backlog, still have a Forest Service, and you still have federal agencies who are constantly trying to gobble up more and more lands. Whereas if they truly believed in stewardship, truly believed in protecting those resources, they would say there should be a moratorium on any further access of federal property, federal monuments, federal designations of any sort whatsoever, until we know that we're managing what we have now appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the agenda's control.
As a matter of fact, I'm very deeply involved with the Montana Forest Stewardship Foundation. I've been a director for a number of years, and I'm actually the chair of the steering committee. We've got a meeting next week to look at a piece of property over by Gardner, Montana, that they want to put into their stewardship program, their legacy program, and that means purchase more money that is going to be tied up administering land, that additional land, when they can't take care of what they've already got. And there are several of us that are on that committee. In fact, the chairman on that committee, Ken, you know quite well, Cedar West. Cedar and I consistently point out that we don't have the money to fund what we already have under management. We don't need to be getting more. And in spite of that, every year they pick up more legacy lands, and it fits beautifully within the footprint of Agenda 21. So, yes. It's pretty amazing to me that we need more of something that we can't take care of anyway, and that they can take money, they can use money to close forest roads, to close access to public lands. And, I mean, they spend a lot of money doing that, and yet they can't maintain the trails that we've got so that we do have public access. That's pretty strange. Ken, you're working with groups now that are really concerned about the public lands issue nationwide. I know a lot of the eastern states are kind of sick of supporting the western states, because we've pretty much become charity cases for the eastern states to send money to support all these public lands on our within our borders. Can you kind of address that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm actually at a conference, national conference of state legislators right now in Indianapolis, and I was with a good representative from South Carolina earlier today, Alan Clemens. And South Carolina did a resolution. They passed a resolution supporting the transfer of public lands to western states. And Representative Clemens makes the comment, he says, we in the East are tired of spending billions of dollars a year for the federal government to mismanage western lands. I mean, last year, 10 million acres burned, to the point that Harriet was raising earlier. My director of wildlife in Utah, they estimate that between 10 and 20 animals per acre are incinerated alive in these fires. And I've got photos, they're tragic. But so 10 million acres, that's 100 to 200 million animals a year incinerated alive, and then their habitat is destroyed for decades. The watershed destroyed for decades, if not generations. And then the air quality impact. The carcinogens that come off of these fires dwarf annual outputs of tailpipes or smokestacks. It's the most hazardous air quality impact that we see in the western United States. Of course, it's not confined to the western United States, but it's just tragic. And then back to your point about not having the revenue, it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, Canada to our north, Canada has an admittedly openly socialist government, but Canada to our north in 2014 transferred land, water, and resources and management to the local provinces and territories. And Dan, what they discovered was when the people whose lives and livelihoods depend upon the wise management of their land control their own land and resources, they get better outcomes environmentally and economically. It's win-win instead of lose-lose under distant, absentee bureaucratic management.
Well, and that's one reason I think that, again, I traveled to Germany. One reason that they are so intent on transferring land from the states down to personal ownership, because they take excellent care of their forests, and they're very productive. Germany has got probably 40 times the use of timber and the income from timber resources than we have in the state of Montana, and they have roughly the same amount of forest in Germany that we do in Montana. It's just ridiculous,
well, you
waste.
You see it all the time. I mean, I get notices almost every week that another mill closed and the town is going to die. I mean, in Montana, it's a perfect example. You've got mill towns like Libby and others that were thriving towns, economies with living wage jobs. They were tending the garden, right? They were taking the overgrowth of weeds, if you will, the trees that were coming, and harvesting the forest down to the sustainable density, not clear cutting. I mean, clear cutting is what we see from these forest fires. We're having the fire hazard clear cutting from the federal government, but these towns were managing their forest in a sustainable way, because if they didn't, their economy dies. And so they had healthy forests, they had healthy habitat, healthy wildlife, healthy economy, and today it's exactly the opposite. The community's dying, the forest is dying, the wildlife is dying, the air is polluted, the watersheds are destroyed. It simply does not have to be that way. It really is time for us to stand up and simply battle for that equal protection of the law and the ability to determine our own destiny and care for our own lands, and that actually benefits the nation as a whole.
I agree. And one thing, we need to take a short break, but when we come back after the break, I would like to, Harriet, have you talk a little bit about how you see the misinformation and the disinformation being handled in the West, because there's an awful lot of information that we see that is just completely wrong, and it's coming out of supposedly responsible places. So we'll talk about that as when we get back from the break. And Kelby, turn it over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the Connecting the Dots show with Dan Happel and the special guest this evening. It's amazing what we can learn just by listening to people who are standing up for our nation and for their own respective state and the state rights. The Republic for the United States of America can be found at republicfortheunitedstates.org. We've been doing these radio shows and calls and conferences for about 8 years. 6 are recorded and on our website for your purview. We do ask that you come out to our Wednesday night call, the Building the States call. This is information on how to re-inhabit the de jure form of this republic nation, county by county, state by state. Also, Monday evenings, we do hold a prayer call and many calls throughout the week. You can get all this information at republicfortheunitedstates.org. Dan, I yield.
Okay, thank you, Kelby. I want to make a comment that I am on the Western Montana BLM RAC. That's a Resource Advisory Council, and one of the reasons I wanted to be on that RAC was because I wanted to have some input into BLM policy and be able to talk about some of the things that are going on in Western Montana. I suggested at a meeting about 6 months ago that Jennifer Fielder, who is the chairman of the American Lands Council, come before the group and talk about the public lands issue and exactly why they needed to consider that when they're making final decisions on the use of resources. And I was browbeaten, and I mean, it was almost embarrassing. Not only did they say no, they said heck no, and they said it very bluntly, and it was other people that were in the group as well, because they've been indoctrinated into believing that we are, the public lands people, are just trying to sell off all the land, and they've been told that nonsense. And so, Harriet, that's a lead-in to your comments on the disinformation.
Well, I appreciate that. I do spend an awful lot of time reading and trying to keep up on the information that is out there. And what you have is that we have a very well orchestrated and very well funded group of organizations that really are not accountable to the folks, even separated from the agencies themselves. At some point, you would think that public employees would have some accountability. Not a lot, but when you've got the Sierra Club and the National and the Heritage Forest Campaign and Wilderness Society and all of these various organizations, what you find is big money, and you find big money. And you find a lot of corruption, and you find a lot of graft, and you find a situation where people are going to misinform the electorate because it's in their best interest to do so. We can talk about the fact that your privately managed lands throughout the western United States, on every single metric that you were to look at, are better managed, better cared for, have better resources, provide more habitat in terms of wildlife and endangered species than public lands, and you can talk until you're blue in the face. It won't make any difference. We all recognize that when you are managing your own resources, you're going to do a better job doing it. But again, I was visiting with a very smart gentleman this week, and his reaction is that it is only the powers that be and only the intellectual giants who work for the federal government who are capable of managing these lands appropriately, regardless of the evidence to the contrary. So there's something else that I do think is very important here that I had not fully appreciated until I have been dealing more and more with these issues, not more and more with these issues, but I've started to figure out a bit more what goes on with these agencies. And when we have a government that is $20 trillion in debt. Our federal government is carrying more debt than any government in the history of the world. I believe that it is probably close to, if not already beyond, actuarially impossible for our government to pay that money back. It's either going to have to inflate its way out of that debt, or it's going to default. And those over the next 10 to 20 years are some of the prospects of what we're facing. Both of those things are going to be absolutely devastating to our economy. I give that information as background because I have found that these federal agencies, whether it's the BLM, the Corps of Engineers, EPA, whatever it is, they are trying to find ways to fund themselves without having to get all of their appropriations through Congress. And what I mean by that, and where I'm starting to figure this out and getting a better handle on what is going on here, is through the EIS process under NEPA. Under the National Environmental Policy Act, if there are federal agencies that have to consult, that have to do environmental impact statements when they are looking at granting additional leases for timber harvest, or for constructing roads in the forest, or enlarging a Bureau of Reclamation reservoir, whatever it may be, building a pipeline that you have to bore under 6 creeks on your way from point A to point B. What these agencies are required to do is they can either do an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. We all know what some of the statistics are on those things. If you need to get an environmental impact statement, for example, from the Corps of Engineers to construct a pipeline and deal with Clean Water Act issues, it can cost you hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it can take years and years and years. But the reason that it costs you that much money is that despite the fact that the legislation says that it is the agency that is supposed to be conducting those, if I want to construct a pipeline, I go to the Corps of Engineers, who may end up being the lead agency if I have to cross 6 creeks, as I've indicated. And they say, that's fine and dandy. We'd love the idea of you constructing this pipeline, but we're going to have to do an EIS. So we need you to sign this little document here that says you will pay for it. And what they do is they're self-funding. They're hiring employees, and they are funding their operations through that EIS. So whereas an EIS could potentially take 3 months, be done with $25,000, it is never in their best interest to do that. We have actually created a bureaucracy under these environmental statutes that the incentive, the actual financial long-term incentive of the agencies is to extend these projects out indefinitely and have them be as expensive as they possibly can, because that money goes to the agencies. They don't account for that to Congress. That's not something that they have to go in and they turn that over to the general fund and we reduce our debt or our deficit with those funds. They fund employees. That's how they keep full employment. So just as a couple of examples, when we were doing the program, the Platte River program, I remember I was at a meeting in Denver, and I was in these absolutely gorgeous offices, and they had artwork on the wall and, numerous secretaries, and everybody had a nice office with windows, and I went in there, and it was the EIS team for the program. And I don't know, maybe 15 people employed by that. And I asked the question, well, whose offices are these? And they said, well, there are offices. And I said, well, you must share offices, because the EIS team, you're temporary. You're only going to be here as we do the EIS for this particular program, and then you go back to your other agencies and do your regular job, don't you? I mean, why do you have these offices? Why? And they said, no, these offices are specifically set up for the Platte River EIS. We're talking millions and millions of dollars that were being funded by the federal government as well as the states, just to create a bureaucracy, solely for the purpose of creating a bureaucracy, solely for the purpose of funding that bureaucracy. I have a situation where I've been working on a pipeline for quite a few years before we could even get the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation to sit down and talk with us. We ended up with the request of, you need to sign this little document right here on this bottom line, and you're going to fund stuff. And what do we fund? We fund employees. And so these agencies are actually incentivized to make this process as expensive as possible and as drawn out as possible. And the longer that we have to live under that kind of a regime, as Ken keeps pointing out, we don't have equal protection under the laws. We're not equal as states. We don't have the ability to really control and dictate our own destiny because we have federal bureaucrats that are saying, sign on the bottom line, Harriet, and you're going to pay me $250,000 to do an EIS that probably could have been done in about 4 months and probably should have cost about $20,000.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, one of the things, too, that I think we have seen with federal agencies is under Bill Clinton in 1993 with the Office of Sustainable Development. The whole mandate of the federal government went from protecting the people and serving the people to protecting the environment and serving the environmentalists. And as a result, I know that a lot of the lawsuits that are filed for Forest Service to close logging, timber sales, and so forth, Forest Service will go in. They've got employees now that just go in and negotiate a settlement with the people that are filing the lawsuit, and there's not even an attempt at any kind of a defense or to open those lands and open those timber sales so that we can start logging again.
They're sue and settle. And what they're doing is they then turn around and they pay those environmental groups their attorney's fees. So what has happened is that the federal government is funding the very people who are doing so much to really, in reality and in the long term, destroy our environment. It's a tragedy. It's ironic. It's sad. It's corrupt. It is a very, very, very corrupt process. We pay the environmental attorneys hundreds of dollars an hour to file what are pattern lawsuits over and over and over again. The federal government does it, but it's the way that a certain party that will remain unnamed right now, that a certain party has found a way to get a lot of federal money in the hands of people that are going to support that party. And I'll be very blunt. The Democrats have figured out how you get money from the federal government into the hands of constituencies that are going to elect Democrats. And this is just simply one of the ways in which they do that.
Well, that's absolutely true and very well stated. One of the things that's come out of all this discussion, though, is the fact that when these lands are turned over to the states, that the states can show a significant profit where the federal government loses money on virtually every acre under their management. Can you folks kind of flesh that statement out a little bit with some of the findings from some of the studies that have been done to determine why we should transfer the lands from the federal government to the states?
Yeah, there's been a number of studies, Dan, and I mean it's common sense if you think about it, but PERC, the Property and Environmental Research Center out of Bozeman, Montana, they've been around for decades. This is what they did. And they studied federal versus state management of public lands. And what they found is, number one, they said, by all accounts, federal lands are in trouble, both economically and environmentally. And they found that for every dollar that the federal government spends managing public lands, it loses 27 cents. And as Harriet pointed out, they're acquiring more. Let's lose money in even more volume. But they also found that for every dollar that the states spend managing public lands, they generate on average a positive $14.51 per dollar spent. And so, when you think about that, it really is a no-brainer. Utah, we commissioned a study, an 18-month study, our 3 top universities, and they did a 700-page analysis and said, clearly the state can afford to manage our own lands because we're going to manage it like a garden, healthy and productive and accessible, instead of the federal government that manages our lands like a museum, hands off, don't touch, dead and dusty. And that's what we see. Let me give you just a quick story. I mean, this is right in Montana last year. Last year, as the fires are raging through, you have the museum management, hands off, don't touch forest. They're overgrown, dead and dying because they crowd all the trees growing up, crowd each other out. And so we get these catastrophic fires. Well, Montana has some of the most elite firefighters, wildland firefighters in the nation, if not the world, Montana State. They have specially equipped helicopters that carry more water faster than anyone else, right? And so as the fires are breaking out on the catastrophic federal lands last year, Montana, you had 5 helicopter crews in the air as the lightning strikes are igniting on the overgrown federal lands. And they're en route to do what they do best, put out fires. They average under 10 acres, they put out the fires. And as they're en route, they're radioed from the U.S. Forest Service, and they say, you have to stand down because your specially equipped helicopters are not on our approved list. And they grounded the state of Montana helicopters, and they sat on their hands and watched thousands and thousands and thousands of acres burned, the air polluted all across the state, wildlife incinerated, watershed destroyed for decades because of this type of bureaucratic control that locks up, burns up, and destroys our lands. It just doesn't have to be this way.
No, you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to be that way. And our Democratic Governor Bullock in this state has openly been against the transfer of public lands. And one of the things that they have consistently said is that don't believe these public lands transfer folks, because all they want to do is get the land and then sell it off to the highest bidder. And in fact, Jennifer Fielder, she's a senator in our state, had a piece of legislation that would have made that impossible. And guess who voted against that legislation? The Democratic senators, the Republican senators that we have in our state who are constantly crossing over and voting with the Democrats, and the people that were doing the loudest lobbying and screaming the loudest were the environmental groups. And yet they're the ones that say we're trying to transfer the public lands so that we can sell it off to the highest bidder. And I hate to say it, but our congressman, Ryan Zinke, has fallen for that nonsense, and we've repeatedly told him that that is not the case, but the message does not get through. How do we deal with these people, and how do we get the message across? What's the best approach that we can use?
Well, think about what's at the heart of that argument. At the heart of that argument is don't trust yourself to govern yourself. For the governor of the state of Montana to say that if Montana controlled the lands, we'd have no control, the lands would be sold off, and he's the governor of the state? No, I mean, to be able to determine our own destiny, if you go to Hawaii, if you drive up the West Coast, you see state parks everywhere. I mean, in Hawaii, right on Waikiki, you have the Kapiolani State Park, the highest rent district maybe in the United States. And it's this big, beautiful state park. Why? Because as people, we value the ability to regenerate, to recreate, to enjoy the beautiful outdoors. That doesn't change because we govern ourselves. And to think that bureaucrats in Washington that don't live where we live, they actually have created, they call it the fire economy in the Forest Service. They come from New Jersey. In fact, there was an article recently, they're coming from Delaware to fight fires, and they don't live where we live. It doesn't matter if the lands burn up. For them, the more they burn, the more they earn. But right. Where we live there and enjoy our lands, to think that we can't govern ourselves and people east of the Rockies that have the same terms of statehood can, that really is just absurd. Now, another point on that is, in the Enabling Acts, if the lands are sold, 95% of the proceeds don't stay with the state. It goes to the federal government to pay the debt. And in every piece of legislation that we've done in Utah, the policy has always been federal public lands become state public lands, because after 120 years of this accident of history, we have all sorts of rights that have developed in grazing and mining and access and recreation. Well, you can no more rip up those property rights and those vested rights and expectations now then it's justifiable to have the federal government continue to violate their obligations. So that's why you need to get to the local level. Land use planning east of the Rockies is done by the counties. We should have the same right to plan and determine our own destiny and our own happiness and prosperity west of the Rockies if we truly believe as a nation in the equal protection of the law.
Right. I absolutely agree. And I know at least in Montana in 1960 we had the sixth highest per capita income in the nation because we were a resource-rich state and we utilized those resources. We mined, we logged, we did a lot of the things that we no longer do. Right now the state of Montana has gone from number 6 in 1960 to number 49 in 2015, and that is a tragedy because we have the resources and we have the ability to utilize those resources and still protect the environment. Harriet, would you like to maybe discuss things that are going on in your neck of the woods and ways that you can see that we can reach out and get average Americans to get on board with the idea that we can manage better than some giant federal leviathan?
You know, I wish that I could say that there was a specific concerted effort in that regard, but the specific concerted effort is through the Ken Ivory process and discussion and education. I sit here and I listen to him speak, and it makes my heart sing because he makes sense. What he's saying is absolutely right. I was thinking about this approach that we have to land management right now, and the idea of doing something different or unique or experiment is just such an antithesis to the way that these lands are managed by the federal government. We're not allowed to experiment. We're not allowed to come up with new ideas of logging or different ways of managing the water resources because you have these enormous octopuses of federal agencies that every time you try to push forward with something, the reaction is no and no and no and no and no. Whereas that if this was a dynamic type of situation where they truly cared about the management, long-term management of the resource and the long-term health of the resource, we would experiment all the time. The Forest Service alone, the vast majority of which is in the western United States, 192 million acres, not all of it, but the vast majority of it is in the western United States. We could be experimenting with all different kinds of things in terms of how to manage those resources to improve wildlife habitat, how to manage those resources for purposes of timber production. There's all different things that we could think about. What it really is going to come down to is it is going to be this battle of the discussion is going to be the battle of ideas. We are fighting against a bureaucracy that starts from the president and the UN and goes down from there to the people at your local level. I sound like I'm critical of federal employees and dislike federal employees, and I don't. There are some very good federal employees out there, but they're not allowed to act either. And they are taught that there is only a certain way that you can do things. And you don't buck that system, because if you buck that system, you're not going to do well in that agency. And so, again, it really does come down to having the ALC conference out in Salt Lake. It comes down to Ken traveling to every state in the nation. I was at the Republican convention last week, and I ran into Dan. Dan visited with him for a bit, not nearly enough, but things were a little crazy back there. But the Maine delegation was right in front of us. Well, Maine doesn't have a lot of federal lands, not a lot of, they do have some state lands, but they don't have a lot of federal ownership, if you will, just like most states in the East don't. But there are people, very wealthy people, who are coming in and they are buying up private lands, and then they are either granting them to the federal government, deeding them to the federal agencies, or they are putting conservation easements on them. So even in those states where they don't have a lot of federal land, they really have a target on their back with the federal government wanting to come in and control more and more and more, despite the fact that they're not managing what they have well now. Kansas has the least amount of federal acreage of any state in the nation, and they are targeting that state absolutely bar none to get more and more and more conservation easements to control and dictate how land can be used. By they, I mean the federal government. The federal government and these environmental agencies, the Nature Conservancy, and those kinds of things. We need to rely on those allies. We need to be educating these people that the legislators and the folks in Maine and Kansas and Florida and all these other places, that just because you think Wyoming is a long way away and you like the idea of it all being owned by the federal government, you got a target on your back too, and you need to align yourselves with us. Freedom and liberty are very, very important concepts, and private property ownership and state control are really the key to ensuring and protecting our liberty and our freedoms.
Boy, that's a perfect statement. And guys, we're nearing the end of the show, and I hate to cut this conversation short because you cannot imagine how much respect and admiration I have for both of you folks, because you are such true patriots for this country. I'd like to offer the last minute or so that you talk about, Harriet, and then Ken, about ways that people can contact you and maybe some of the things that you're working on right now. And I'll turn the last minute over to you guys.
Ken, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Dan. So just to give you a quick frame of reference, if you think about the Louisiana Purchase, it changed not only the United States but the world, because our greatest resource is our human resource, our people, the ingenuity, creativity. And if you secure people in their property and their liberty and give them the ability to determine their own destiny, they create wealth and happiness and peace and incredible advancements. The Louisiana Purchase was 530 million acres. The federal government today controls 640 million acres. Even if you take 200 million acres off the table for national parks and monuments and wilderness, we're not talking about those, you still have the modern-day equivalent of a Louisiana Purchase if we secure people in their liberty and property and the ability to determine their own destiny and unleash that brilliant human creativity and ingenuity. And that's the only recipe for peace and prosperity. We will fail any other direction but the genius recipe of the American promise. So what we need people to do, we need people to contact their representatives at all levels and tell them we need to honor the American promise. We need to treat states equally for the sake of the union as well as the sake of our individual communities. I can be reached at my email is ken at 3 greatrights.com. And it is absolutely critical. We need to educate. We need to mobilize. There's a wealth of information at the American Lands Council website and Facebook pages, americanlandscouncil.org. But we have to engage. We have to decide that we're going to govern ourselves and prepare for our posterity the blessings that we received of liberty and property and self-determination, or we'll be held accountable for letting those blessings slide away.
Correct. Okay, Harriet, I'm sorry to leave you such a short time, but can you quickly let people know the best way to contact you?
Well, yes, Harriet Hageman, and I'm in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I have my own law firm. It's Hageman Law. And you can go to our I think that it's like HagemanLaw.com. I never go to it. But I'm obviously in the book. HAgeman@HagemanLaw.com is my email address. And I also can be reached at 307-635-4888 is my office telephone number. And I'd be happy to answer folks' questions. And I look forward to working with both of you gentlemen further on this important.
Well, we've got to continue this conversation again, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being guests on this show. This is the kind of information we need to get before the listening public, and this is the best way we can do it. So with that said, Kelby, turn the show back over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Wow, what a show. Very interesting how people in this country are telling the truth and giving such distinct information pertaining to really what's happening on federal versus state. I would suggest everybody go to simply Google and type federal land and take a look at really what they own and control, and then ask yourself why and what you can do to support people like as the guests are on the show tonight. That will conclude this call for this week, and we look forward to seeing you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific. God bless and good night.